gonna mute everybody just so that we would be able to start. Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Here we go. So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. We're just gonna start until my program tells me that it's ready. Here we go. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. And today we're going to continue what we started out last week. So generally speaking, we're going to speak about a number of topics. Number one is the issue of Shi'ism. How is Shia different from Sunni? This is a very common question. And of course, I'm not going to go in all the details because when we're talking about Shi'ism, that itself is really, what should I say? It's a topic on its own. It's a specialty on its own. And we're not going to go into all the details. We're just going to go really quick when we're talking about Shi'ism, is that we're talking about a number of different issues. So how are the Sunnis different from the Shias? That's the usually common question. And I remember when I was a little girl, people would ask me, am I Shia or Sunni? And I just used to use the word Shia, even though my name says it. But I used to use the word Shia. I thought it because it sounded nicer. I don't know why on earth it sounded nicer in my ear. But there's a very important thing that we have to understand about Shia when we're talking about Shiism versus Sunnism. Shiism really started out with this very tragic event that happened to the Prophet ﷺ's grandson. So that tragic event, although in 41st year Hijrah, so I'm going to break it down even more. So during the time after the Prophet ﷺ's death, there was this controversy, who should be next in taking over the lead after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. They were definitely, in shock with this tragic event, not really sure what to do with it. But it wasn't until they had decided that the Prophet ﷺ, looking at what the Prophet ﷺ had said, that the Khalifa should be from Quraysh, the person that was supposed to be after the Prophet ﷺ was supposed to be from Quraysh and not from the Ansar. And then, slowly going down, well, you got other groups that considered that no, the Khalifa is supposed to be from al-Bayt, from the household of the Prophet ﷺ. And that is the first thought of Ali ibn Abi Talib, until down the road, he actually, although paid or pledged to the Prophet ﷺ 6 months after Abu Bakr as-Siddiq's assignment for Khalifa, but later, of course, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, later the Umar ibn al-Khattab's assassination with Abu Lu'lu'a, etc. Then at the time of Abu Uthman bin Affan, that's when that confusion continued, because the assassination and the killing of Uthman bin Affan went farther than just killing somebody just like Umar ibn al-Khattab, because there was an actual plot. There was an actual revolution against Uthman bin Affan. There was a group of gangsters that were really trying to divide the ummah, and there was the confusion: should we go after those that killed Uthman bin Affan, or should our priority be finding a leader first, and then we'll go after those that are causing this division and causing all those riots that might be dividing the ummah. So it wasn't until, of course, Ali ibn Abi Talib suggested that no, we gotta find the Khalifa first. Ali ibn Abi Talib is then pledged, or many pledged for Ali ibn Abi Talib to be the Khalifa. On the other hand, Mu'adh ibn Abi Sufyan, being from the tribe of Uthman bin Affan, felt that was somehow being negligent over the political situation that is at stake, and also Uthman bin Affan's blood, or at least their tribe's honor. Now, having that being said, it is very important to understand that Mu'adh ibn Abi Sufyan did not whatsoever regard that Ali ibn Abi Talib was in any way less than him. In fact, Mu'awiyah ibn Abi Sufyan knows very well that Ali ibn Abi Talib is actually considered one of the earliest ones to become Muslim, the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ. And in fact, when Ali ibn Abi Talib was killed, Mu'awiyah ibn Abi Sufyan actually cried over Ali ibn Abi Talib. Now, to fast forward, when we're talking about the story, there was a very major event that happened during that time, which is the killing of Ammar ibn Yasir. Now, Ammar ibn Yasir, why was the assassination of Ammar ibn Yasir was a very pivotal moment? Well, the reason why is that Ammar ibn Yasir, the Prophet ﷺ had foretold that Ammar ibn Yasir would be killed by the oppressor group, or the oppressing group. Now, this was supposed to be bringing an end, but it wasn't until another group was benefiting from this division, and that was the Abdullah ibn Saba, and who was bringing in those divisions by killing from both sides and getting away with it, and every single side was thinking that it was the other person that was breaking the truce. To fast forward, this event did not actually stay within this political situation, but it actually expanded farther, and it actually later resulted into regarding every single Sahabi, every single one of the Prophet's companions, whoever was participating or at least siding Mu'awiyah ibn Abi Sufyan in any way, that they were, whether they were with opinion or whether they had engaged in the battle, was enough evidence to disregard them or even go farther. So it wasn't just that battle, Ma'arakat al-Jamal, but it was everybody, including Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, including Umar ibn al-Khattab, who in the beginning, Ali ibn Abi Talib himself had pledged to them to be assigned as Khalifa, but still regarded them as evil companions, and therefore as not companions, but actually as kafirs. And the same thing with the Sayyida Aisha. With the Sayyida Aisha, they regarded them or her as a kafir as well. Now, this acts as the main issue, or the main base for rejecting most of the companions for that political stance that they had considered, and later had regarded, or at least for some Shia, regarded that the Quran was incomplete, and that there was going to be another Quran called Quran Fatima that was later going to be by Mahdi, or by who they will always say Ajjalallahu Farajah, and that was going to be bringing in that completion of Islam. So this is not all the Shias, by the way. It's very important to keep in mind that not all Shias are necessarily on the same page, but it's really important to mention that the only ahadith, so we've got a number of ahadith that are acceptable, and the only ones that are acceptable are the ones that are narrated by a limited number of the Prophet ﷺ's companions. Now, having that being said, when we're looking at the Quran, and again, this is not all the Shias, this is not all the Sunnis, but this is a large number of Shias, whether we're talking about Ja'fari or Imamiyya, which is considered the largest majority. And when we're looking at that foundation itself, in the fiqh later, it actually acted as the base. So if you're talking about any idea, you're always going to go back to the base of any idea. So the base of Shi'ism, in where the Quran itself is not necessarily going to be interpreted in the way that Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah would interpret based on hadith. So even the hadith that Shi'as would go back to, they don't acknowledge al-Bukhari, and they don't acknowledge Sahih Muslim either. They consider Abu Huraira as a deviant Sahabi. Sayyida Aisha is, a place of worship in the place of worship, they will actually use derogatory swearing terms at Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Ali, Umar ibn al-Khattab, Sayyida Aisha, and that is considered a way of worship. So what part of the act of worship is really just doing all that swearing at the Sahaba. So this is considered. So when we're looking at the foundation, we're seeing that the epistemological difference, meaning the foundation of Sunnism and Shiism, is totally different, because the science in itself, in terms of hadith, for example, is very different. It's very different. So the way that the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah would regard a hadith, and even in the critical research that Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah would research, is totally different than the way Shias would regard the resources of their hadith. So the resources that they would consider are not the Sahih Muslim, not Sahih al-Bukhari, and even when it comes to the Quran, of course, if you're not going to go to those resources, that means you're going to go to other resources, whether it's al-Kafi al-Kullini, or you're going to go Bahar al-Anwar, you're going to go to al-Majalisi, or etc., and you're going to go to different resources to interpret the Quran for you, and those resources are going to be not the same. If the people that they regard are the references to interpret Islam, well, that would tell you that the interpretation is going to be totally different, that the implication, even in the way fiqh is understood, is going to be in very many ways very different. So whenever you take any philosophy, the philosophy is going to determine the implication on ground and the practical life on ground, and because it's going to go back to a resource. So when we're looking at the books of hadith for Shias, they're the holy books that they would consider them, the references that they would consider as the references to interpret the religion, are totally different, because they would consider that the acceptable Sahaba are totally different. So what is the difference in short? So the Sunnis would regard that all the Sahaba who met the Prophet ﷺ and died as Muslim are acceptable resources to interpret Islam. Versus the Shia, so let me emphasize that this is really important. So when we're looking at a cumulative number of Sahaba, we're all considered a base to help us understand Islam from the Prophet ﷺ. So all that number, and regardless of the political opinion that they had held regarding who's the Khalifa, and whether that political situation, whether it was the priority to have a Khalifa, or whether the priority was to seek the killing, or those that had killed Ali, Uthman bin Affan or not. So for a Sunni, they would regard that, no, in the end, is that was a political perspective that does not affect somebody's faith, and therefore the Sahaba, they acted based on their ijtihad for that moment, and they're still considered as udul. They're still considered as acceptable resource to understand Islam and to help us understand the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ, and that's how it reached to us. The Shias, on the other side, they would regard that, no, not everyone was considered from the Sahaba as a considerable reference or a resource to help us understand Islam, and that only very limited people from Ahlul Bayt were considered as an acceptable resource, and those were the ones that supported Ali ibn Abi Talib, period. If anybody did not support Ali ibn Abi Talib in this whole political situation, it later became the Aqidah of Shi'ism. So when we're looking at Shi'ism, the Aqidah is really based on that political situation, which is right now considered the main Aqidah that takes in and decides all the different practical things that relate to that. So even today, when we're looking at the political situation, whether in Iran, in Iraq, in Syria, the political situation because it was based on that moment then, that political situation then, Shias will still view that the ones, or will still view actually, that anyone accepting the Sahaba, whether it's Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, whether it's Umar ibn al-Khattab, Sayyida Aisha, considering them as udul or considering them as Sahaba, is an enough reason to mean that they were rejecting that they were rejecting that they were rejecting Ali ibn Abi Talib, and that was an enough reason to wage a war on these people and hold them accountable for the death of Al-Hussein later on. Al-Hussein later on in Karbala. So unfortunately today, when we're looking at Shi'ism, more of a cult that is becoming very, I would say, heavily armed, and causing all these different massacres in Syria or in Iraq, and in different places, and also in Iran, in different parts of Iran against the Sunnis there. And it's really important to mention that Shi'ism did not start from Iran. This is a very common um, uh, misinformation, that people would think that Shi'ism started from Iran. It did not actually start from Iran. Shi'ism actually started within Iraq, and later Ismail al-Safawi, he was the one that later embraced Shi'ism. He was only a 16-year-old man, leader, whatever you want to call him, and it wasn't until he had taken that position, which is in Iran, that he actually brought in the different scholars from Qum and the Najaf in order to spread and enforce Shi'ism onto Iran. And that's where it became the religion that was the most practiced in Iran. But again, it's really important to mention these things and their impact on today's political situation between the Sunnis and the Shias, whether we're talking about Yemen, between Al-Houthi, and also, of course, Al-Houthi is actually a Zaydi Shia. But of course, because Shi'ism right now wants to use religion in order to expand politically, it wanted to use that, I would say, that bridge in order to expand politically, and that's what is causing all those divisions. Throughout history, the Sunni and the Shia were actually living in, I would say, in some harmony, but throughout history, the Sunnis and the Shias, I must admit, there was a lot of misunderstanding from the Sunni towards the Shia, and even from the Shia towards the Sunni. So throughout history, there was that division. And to think that we can somehow make a dialogue and end this in dialogue, this was an attempt that modern scholars actually tried to do, but it was later, I would say, halted. And part of those that wanted to do this was Al-Qardawi and a number of other modern scholars. But then they realized that that was really paving the way for the spread of Shi'ism, and that the Sunnis were unaware that Shi'ism was acting more of a political movement than actually of any way of trying to do dialogue or to bring about some common grounds. So that's when all those calls to bring about the ta'ayush, or to bring about that Sunni Shia dialogue, really ended. And I would say it really ended, especially when we're talking about Nafisi getting involved, and you had a number of other scholars that were more aware of the historical division and the impact of it. But then it went political, and I would say military, especially when Iran wanted to use, of course, Nusayriya in Syria as a way to pave Iranian Iranian control over Syria and over Damascus in general. So for a lot of the Shias, they would consider that this is continuing the Shiism expansion. Oh, it's really important to mention that the Shia Sunni division is not recent, by the way. The division was going into different ebb and flow, if you would want to say, the ebb and flow, whether it was from the time of Al-Ubaidiyya or slash Fatimiyya, what they want to call themselves. There was that Al-Ubaidiyyin who controlled a large area of North Africa, and also at the same time there were Al-Abbasiyyin that were at odds, and that ebb and flow between Al-Ubaidiyya, Al-Muwahhidin, and also at different times when Al-Abbasiyin were I would say with a dagger really from a lot from within, where the Shias were in alliance with the Mongols, and also at other times were in alliance with the Crusades. So that brought in that fear in where is this going to be an ongoing betrayal? So how did this really happen? Where and why was this betrayal, treason, why was it committed? So the Shias were generally always the minority. And because they were a minority, acted with a mindset of a minority, and regarded that it was justified to be in alliance with another stronger group, even if that meant a non-Muslim group, in order to defeat the stronger Muslim group, which is the Sunni group. What does that mean? Let's put it on ground. So there were times when, for example, Fatimiyin, as an example, they were ruling Egypt at the time, but they were actually in alliance with the Crusades, in alliance with the Crusades, and they saw that as justifiable in order to make sure that they're not going to be defeated by a larger Muslim Sunni group. And at the time, at least, when we're looking at, for example, Imad ad-Din Zinki, when we're looking at Nur ad-Din Zinki later on, and it wasn't until Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, until Al-Adid, who was the king at the time, that actually pledged, or that actually gave Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi the ability to take over. And it wasn't until then that all this happened. So, for example, Shias would regard that Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi is nothing but an evil man, and the Sayyida Aisha is nothing but a prostitute, and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq and Umar ibn al-Khattab were nothing but Satan in disguise. When we're looking at that, I'm sure some of you are actually listening to this and in shock. How is that so? And this is unfortunately, this is the reality of a lot of the different things. You might have thought that political situation just ended there. It was just a political opinion and that was the end of the story. But to really know that, no, it unfolded in different political ways and different military ways, or even in different sides of even the religion. So when we're looking at the religion, for example, to disregard, let's take an example of Zawaj al-Mut'a, which is the most famous thing. When we're looking at the Mut'a marriage, so what does Mut'a marriage mean? Mut'a marriage simply means that a person would get married to a woman probably for a number of hours, maybe a day, 2, 3 days, and then they would end it. And it can be for an unlimited really number of women, and move on. So when we're looking at a marriage that can last for a couple of hours, and another marriage later on, 2 days, 3 days, etc., and there's a whole different set of things. Of course, for the Sunni, they would say, well, wait a minute, we've got a hadith where it was narrated by Ali ibn Abi Talib, and this hadith isn't Sahih al-Bukhari, narrated by who? By Ali ibn Abi Talib, that the Prophet ﷺ had actually limited and put an end from that day until Yawm al-Qiyamah, until Judgment Day, and ended one eating donkey's meat, and 2 Mut'a marriage. And Mut'a marriage And of course, when we're looking at Ali ibn Abi Talib actually saying that that was considered the main foundation for the evidence to prove that the Prophet ﷺ had actually ended mut'a marriage, and who's the narrator? It was actually Ali ibn Abi Talib. So for the Shias, they would totally reject that and consider that no, we've got a different narration. It was Abdullah ibn Abbas. Now Abdullah ibn Abbas, when the Prophet ﷺ had died, Abdullah ibn Abbas was only 13 years old at the time, so which is pretty much a young boy compared to Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was in his early 30s or late 20s. So when we're looking at Ali ibn Abi Talib, and of course already married, so definitely when it comes to fiqh of marriage, he's definitely going to have more information about that than Abdullah ibn Abbas. So this is just an example of how it unfolds in different ways, even in culture. So a lot of times, sisters that come to me and say, I got a proposal from a brother, who is Shia. Do you recommend this? And although I wouldn't necessarily say that this is haram, because if I were to say this is haram, that would mean that this marriage is invalid, period. That would mean the marriage is invalid, period, and therefore the act is called zina. That's what it means to say an invalid marriage. The marriage is not invalid because this person is, this person, I'm not saying, to swear at the Sahaba, etc., is not kufr, but we're talking about, bid'ah mukaffira and bid'ah ghair mukaffira, but regardless, that's a different topic. But when I would get a situation like that, it's really important to understand that when down the road this marriage takes place, if the resources that you depend on are regarded invalid for the other person, and you're regarding those resources as, right after the Quran, or at least the interpretation of the Quran. This is how the Quran was interpreted by, here's my evidence, here's the hadith, etc. And they would regard it that this is not the right interpretation. Now, we're then at odds, even in the foundation, let alone the interpretation that's based on that foundation. If the foundation we can't really agree on, can we agree on the interpretation and the implication of that interpretation? So that's why I would always tell the sisters, you have to understand that this is an epistemological difference and not an issue of personality. This is an epistemological difference. It's kind of like, do we go back to the same resources? Are we really here having a base and a foundation that we can, somehow agree on and respect each other's views on? So then it becomes a clashing point. And that's where I would say it's not an invalid marriage, but I would say, there are some things that you have to keep in mind. And when we're talking about the epistemological differences, we're actually talking about foundational differences that can have major implications in bringing about a dialogue. So the other part I would like to also, the issue of Shiism is a really long issue, but we're just here just getting you some taste of where and the evolution of Muslim thinking, the issue of Shiism, Sunnism, and today, and how it's unfolding in today's political situations in Iraq, Iran, etc. And right now, when we're looking at how it's unfolding, remember the Shias would consider that it's unfolding in order to bring about al-Mahdi, and that fighting in Syria and committing all those massacres is somehow justifiable because it is retaliating. It is acting in retaliation against all the different brutality that was committed against al-Hussein. Even if somebody is not at all accountable or responsible for the killing of al-Hussein, they would still view them that just because you've got the name Umar, or just because you are Sunni, that's an enough accusation and enough reason to hold you accountable for that blood. And therefore the women's ird, meaning raping them, is justifiable because their ird is not is not muhtaram, their ird is not respected, their life is not respected, neither their children, etc. And unfortunately, this is actually this is actually what is going on in Syria or even in Yemen. But it's also fair to say, and it's really important to say, is that in some areas it is indeed fair to say that in some areas there were a lot of injustices against the Shias in the predominantly Sunni areas, such as Bahrain. There were a lot of injustices against the Shias, or even in Iraq at one point. Under Saddam. Although Saddam was not, he was a national and Arab nationalist, so he was not necessarily, a Sunni leader, but he was more of a nationalist than anything else. But they were still, I would say, oppressed within a predominantly Sunni area, whether in Bahrain or even in Iraq or in other places in the predominantly Sunni areas. There were a lot of injustices on a financial level, on many levels, let's say, out there. So this is not to say that there weren't any injustices that were happening against the Shias in the predominantly Sunni areas. But that does not at all justify. So yes, those injustices do happen and did happen and still do happen, but it does not mean that two wrongs, like they say, two wrongs don't make right. It does not mean that to retaliate those injustices in the way that it's happening in Syria or in Iraq or even in Iran is in any way acceptable. Is that what the religion teaches? Again, it's really important to keep in mind that Shi'ism is more of a cult, more of the leader, the person. There's lots of Gnosticism in where it is the religious leader that interprets the religion, and it's not the text. It's very different from the Sunni, because the Sunni, it's the text that regards something right and wrong, and it's not the leader. It's not the leader. But in Shi'ism, the leader has some direct connection, especially if he's from Ahl al-Bayt, and that's where that white turban compared to the black turban comes in where the leader or the Sayyid is the person that has a direct connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore is capable of interpreting the religion and interpreting the religion. So when we talk about Al-Khomeini, for example, he's considered as somehow directly connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not just the words, but he's directly having some kind of a holiness, a divine connection to interpret the religion. So when we're looking at Khomeini, for example, he isn't just a religious leader, but he's also a political leader, according to the Shias, at least al-Ithna Ashariya in this situation. So when we look at that, we have to understand what forms an opinion. What forms an opinion that is very different from Sunni, in where you could be a Muslim leader and not necessarily regarded as the reference, because that would be your political reading, your understanding of the political situation, but you wouldn't necessarily be regarded as a religious leader to determine right and wrong and how we understand the world around us or how we interpret the text. Unlike Shi'ism, in where no, the religious leader is going to act as a holy figure, and that's called Gnosticism. The religious leader is going to be considered as the reference to interpret the religion, to interpret the faith, and therefore the main point and the main pillar within that faith. Any questions before I move on to our next issue, which is the female scholars within the Muslim community? Then it seems like there are no questions about Shi'ism, so I'll move on. And of course, I'd like to keep in mind, and I'd like to also emphasize that when we talk about Shi'ism, that it doesn't mean that all the Shias are the same. So Nusayriya, although they would say that they're Shia, but doesn't mean that they are to be at the same level, or at least to be talked about the same way that we would talk about al-Ithna Ashariya or al-Ja'fariya. That's a totally different group, or even a Zaydiyya. So when we're talking about different Shias, there's so many different Shias, so don't necessarily say, well, Zaydiyya or Nusayriya are the same, or etc., or Ismailiya are the same. They're not the same. There are different ways of understanding even within those religions. So, for example, Ithna Ashariya would actually regard al-Ismailiya as kuffar, and so they are. Same thing with Shia, al-Ithna Ashariya or al-Ja'fariya. The Shia within Nusayriya, which are the Syrian Bashar al-Assad Shi'ism, they would regard it as kuffar as well. But still, when it came to political alliances, they did not have a problem with making a political alliance with Bashar al-Assad, although he is Nusayri and they don't regard him as Sunni, but still considered that there were closer alliances or closer reasons to make an alliance with a Nusayriya who considered Ali as God himself, than actually Sunnis. So they would consider them closer to them than actually a Sunni. Here's a question. So is Shi'ism Muslim if they are regarding leaders as interpreters? So you want to keep in mind that although this is called Gnosticism, but yes, they are. It depends. Now, when we're talking about kufr and iman, somebody can consider that, a religious leader like al-Khomeini, for example, that he has a closer, or at least a closer relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than anybody else to interpret the religion. But that doesn't necessarily mean that is the reason for considering somebody kafir or Muslim, because the issue of Gnosticism is not only in Shi'ism, by the way. It's also the case with Sufi. Sufis would also regard that Gnosticism, or that religious leaders or that shaykh has some kind of connection with God Almighty, and therefore is holy in some way and has some level of holiness. So they're not attributing Khomeini to being a prophet. Not whatsoever. Not any Shia person would regard al-Khomeini as a prophet, but they would regard that they had reached a certain level of religious understanding, that they were closer to a divine understanding than they were closer to a divine understanding than any other person, and therefore they would be the holy ones to interpret the religion or interpret the political situation, and that they are closer to God Almighty in being able and capable of bringing in that holy interpretation. But again, this isn't just Shi'ism, but that's the case with Sufis as well. In where with Sufis, they would regard that a person reaches a certain level of al-maqam, and that they reach a level of al-kashf al-hujub, and that the barriers between any human being and anybody else in life around you, you would have all these barriers, and you can't see al-ghaib, you can't see the unseen. But for Sufis, they would also regard that the shaykh was capable of going beyond these hujub, beyond these barriers, and that they were able to see even al-ghaib, including probably what you are, what you do, or even what you have been dreaming of, and they consider that as al-kashf. So this is just a very limited talk about Shi'ism. So it's not all the same. But let's move on. When we're talking about Shi'ism, of course, that's a whole different subject. But I think it's really important to understand, well, why did it unfold in the political way that we're seeing it right now? And how do we understand all that? By the way, these, like I said, these political tensions are not new. They were there throughout history. They were there throughout the Muslim history, and unfortunately, because of the massive wars the massive wars that were between the Sunni and Shia throughout history that led to a lot of creating stereotypical images, by the way. Were a lot of stereotypical images in where if you were to talk to a Shia about Sunnis, they will have all these misinformations about the Sunni and what really Sunnism is. And the same thing with Sunnis, they will have a lot of misinterpretation and stereotypical images about Shiism as well. And a lot of it really comes from the miscommunication and from not being, not being able to, at all, even uh, be able to understand one another. So there was throughout history, it was all political and military divisions that created even a bigger gap, created a bigger gap, and which led in this type of military gap that we're in today. So there are different stereotypical images from Sunnis against Shias and from Shias against Sunnis. This is very common. And even when you go to, for example, Syria, Lebanon, I was in Lebanon last year, and when you're walking in those areas that are predominantly Shia, it's just just walking there and saying that your name is Aisha is usually looked at with lots of scrutiny, lots of skepticism. In where, what are you doing here? It's not. It's always put in place of fear and not wanting to get near at all. So you could see there's a lot of stereotypical image just by knowing that your name is Aisha isn't enough. Is enough itself to somehow regard you as a place of disrespect, as a place of fear, as a place of what is that word that I could use, but betrayal, and the list goes on and on. So there's a lot of, and unfortunately within the Shias, there is a lot of consideration for what is called a taqiyya, which is hiding what you really are. So it's a type of hypocrisy which they consider that Ali ibn Abi Talib also practiced with Umar ibn al-Khattab when he got his daughter married to him. And so they would consider that was one form, that although this way of practicing taqiyya was really enhanced because, one, they were a minority, so their way of getting around was in a way where you're hiding what you really believe in as a minority, and therefore it later became that it is justifiable and accepted, and considered as part of the faith. And it continued until the time of today, to be something that this is how you deal with the people around you in order to preserve your faith and in order to grow strong. So anyhow, this is really a long topic, but I think it's, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer. I know that many out there may sometimes, when it comes to the Shia Sunni topic, a lot of times it can be a sensitive topic for many. But like I said, this topic, we can't discuss it in a 5-minute session, or even, although we were talking about for almost 50 minutes right now. But it's really important to keep in mind that these topics, we could only talk about it in understanding how it unfolded, how the idea itself unfolded in the life that we're in, or even the political situation that we are in right now, and how do we understand from it. Unfortunately, we could just talk a little about it, but I'm going to go to a different topic. Where were the female scholars? Now, when we're talking about where were the female scholars, of course, there's a lot to say about where were the female scholars. But before we talk about that, it's really important to set a few points here. Number one is that women were obligated to seek knowledge. Where in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ actually says that al-ilmu farida ala kulli muslim. Talab al-ilm or seeking ilm is actually obligatory on every Muslim. By the word every Muslim, it didn't say on every Muslim and Muslimah, but by definition, on every Muslim would actually include Muslim men and Muslim women. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق, seeking knowledge, and the base of talab al-ilm was actually considered as holy or obligatory from the very foundation of Islam. Women also asked the Prophet ﷺ to have a day to learn, as the hadith in Sahihain where Abu Sa'id al-Khudri actually said that the Prophet ﷺ was approached by the women and they said, O Prophet of Allah, the men went away with your ahadith, meaning they had the privilege to learn from you, but can you make a day where we would come and approach and actually have our questions asked? And of course, in order for us to learn, tu'allimuna mimma 'allamaka Allah, that you would teach us from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had taught you. So the Prophet ﷺ said, اجتمعنا في يوم كذا في مكان كذا, that why don't you just gather in such a place on such a day? And they did gather, and the Prophet ﷺ was teaching them on that day. Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu used to say, in Jahiliyyah, we did not regard women anything at all until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed ayat regarding them and gave them what He had given, meaning gave them what He had given them from the different privileges in Islam. Now, when we talk about the different ways that women learned during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they did attend the masajid. In fact, Sayyidah Aysha actually said that, or the Prophet ﷺ actually said, do not prevent women from their part, meaning from attending the masjid and being part of it. Hisham bint al-Harith said that the Prophet ﷺ, that she had learned Surah Al-Kahf from Surah Qaf, from the Prophet ﷺ, only from hearing it in the masjid. So you could see that the women were present at the masjid, were learning from the Prophet ﷺ. And of course, the question is, well, we know that the wives of the Prophet ﷺ were considered the most important figures in teaching Islam later on. Whether it was Sayyidah Aysha, whether it was Salama, we've got a number of different figures that were learning from the Prophet ﷺ directly and passing it on to everyone else. But when we're looking at the different narrators, there were from the female companions from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, from the female companions, we're talking about 210 female companions, and they were considered the most important narrators, and that narrated and learned from the Prophet ﷺ directly, in comparison with 1,642 male companion narrators. So you could see the huge difference, meaning that not many women were necessarily engaging in the teaching process. That doesn't mean that they were not learning, but it means that in order to teach it to others, that they were engaged in teaching, they were engaged in narrating, etc. Only 210 women companions were involved. 1,642 male companions were there. Now, the most important figures that were considered as the main teachers were, of course, the Prophet ﷺ's wives, and on the top of all of them was really Sayyidah Aysha, who narrated 2,210 ahadith. Salama narrated 378 ahadith, and Maymuna narrated 76 ahadith. Other women that had narrated, Asma bint Yazid ibn Sakan, 81 ahadith, Asma bint Umays, 60 ahadith, Asma bint Abu Bakr as-Siddiq narrated 58 ahadith. You could see that not many compared to the other Sahaba. When you're talking about the other male Sahaba, those are the most important female narrators. So just look at their names and see how many ahadith I had narrated. The other generation after Sahabiyat, after the Prophet ﷺ's companions, you had another group which are considered the tabi'in. So a Sahabi is different than a tabi'i, because a Sahabi is somebody that met the Prophet ﷺ Muslim, died as Muslim. That was going to be the companion. The tabi'i, which is this word right here, is basically the person that met the Sahabi and learned from them. So the most important figures that were considered from the Tabi'een. I just wanted to name just a couple right here of Kulthum bint Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, the Zawj Anas ibn Malik, the Anas ibn Malik's wife, Zainab, Safiya, Abdullah ibn Umar's wife. So we're looking at a number of names. Zawj Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, got Zainab right here. Mawlat Salama, meaning Mawla. When we're looking at Mawla, it's really important to look at the word Tabi'i and consider Mawali. Most of the scholars that were from the Tabi'in were actually Mawali. What does that mean? The word Mawali means that they were slaves. They were slaves and they were freed by them. So Salama had a slave and her name was Khayra. And Salama freed her and she was Mawlat Salama. Now, why are they the most important scholars too? And the most important 7 scholars in Medina, the most important 7 scholars in Mecca, etc., are all from the Mawali, because a lot of them were actually in direct relationship with the most important Sahaba, and therefore actually taught and learned from the Sahaba directly and later taught. Now let's move on. The women that joined in teaching. You got some women joined in teaching, but it's really important. So what about the issue of teaching men? Was that something that women practiced? Well, here's the thing, is that for that question, there is a difference between the women that are considered from Shawab, the young women, teenaged women, young, vibrant women, and between the other elderly women. So elderly women were usually between, they were considering them from 35 and up and 40 and up. And the young Shawab were mainly in the young teenage or early, or at least early 20s. When we're looking at the women that joined in teaching, they were very few, really, the women that joined in teaching. And when we're talking about teaching here, we're mainly talking about teaching men. The women that were teaching were very few, but such as the daughter of Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, but you could see that she taught her husband, although, Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, daughter of Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib was teaching her husband, and who was actually Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib's student. What does that tell us? That Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib's daughter was pretty much a scholar who was even, at a high level, compared to the other students who were attending Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib's classes. Imam Malik, his own daughter, was correcting the students, but she was knocking at the door whenever that student was making a mistake. So why wasn't she actually being a para, teaching along with her father, Imam Malik, and why hide behind a door and not actually be there present? So the issue of modesty takes a lot within within the male-female relationship within a Muslim society. The issue of modesty and sawt al-mar'a and the woman's voice, etc. There were many different issues, but those were on the most important things on the list, in where is it okay, is it permissible that a younger woman would get involved and actually stand in front of a male crowd, and actually teach them Islam. Same thing when we're talking about not necessarily teaching in front of, but even taking the lead to teach Islam. Now that's why you've got most of the women that were engaged in teaching were really from the elderly and not from the younger generation. So what about Sayyidah Aisha? Where did they get that from? Was it somehow a form of extremism, or was it something that they had been inspired by the Quran? So it's actually one, it is inspired by the Quran, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had, number one, permit that women would learn Islam, ask questions, but then when you look at, for example, doing the adhan, women don't do the adhan, even though it's actually calling for prayer. Women don't do khutbat al-jumu'ah, for example, even though it's engaging in teaching Islam. So when we're looking at, for example, teaching at or making a khutbat al-jum'ah, khutbat al-eid, the ceremony for even rituals. If a ceremony for a ritual a woman was not doing, so how is she going to be engaging in something that is very similar in at least the setting, in the definition, in the form of it? In the structure of it is pretty much the same type of gathering, in where she's standing on a pulpit. Let's assume she's got a hijab, and right there, she's giving a khutbah al-jumu'ah, and but that was never done by the Prophet ﷺ. So that was actually inspired by those by those things within Islam. So it's not that they were somehow extreme in not letting women actually engage in that. So they did get the inspiration from that, and considered that that was part of modesty, and therefore therefore it wasn't allowed. So what about the other women, or the other women, even though they were still considered not necessarily very old, but within, I would say, within 40s, early 40s, or probably late 40s, but still were teaching. And let's give some examples. And if you actually go to a book, it's called أعلام النساء. أعلام النساء, Umar Rida Kahala. Umar Rida Kahala, he did a magnificent job in almost 5-volumed book. And what he did is that he combined all the names of the most important figures within the Arab / Muslim society at the time. And Umar al-Kahala, he did all these biographies, combined them, and it's really important to mention that in that bibliography that he wrote, it was not limited to Muslim women and Muslim scholars. So there were other names that were mentioned on there. In fact, some of it might mention Jewish women. They were just the most important figures. But he does mention a lot of the different names, and I actually went through all the different volumes, and he doesn't mention a number of different figures. From the figures that he mentions were some women that were considered scholars in Madhab Shafi'i, scholars in Madhab Maliki, scholars in Madhab such and such. But what I realized is that most of those women that were mentioned were really female scholars, where their scholarship depended a lot on the oral transmission of the science, and not scribing the science. So that oral transmission would mean like teaching hadith, and this hadith would be taught to somebody else, and somebody else would teach it to somebody else. Same thing when we're talking about Quran. So you find more female scholars in hadith and in tafsir than actually in fiqh, and even less in usul al-fiqh. So why? It's kind of like when we look at today, in where you're seeing more women, teaching probably tajweed and Quran than you would find women probably in a fiqh council, or women actually giving fatwa. There are so many different reasons to that. Number one is that in order to engage in fatwa, you would need to be in those areas that are receiving those inquiries. And women were not in those positions within the government. Who was really getting the issues, who was really getting those cases coming to them, was either going to be the Imam al-Masjid, or it's going to be the Qadi, or it's going to be the judge. Those, or the person that is teaching at the masjid. So the person that is teaching at the masjid is definitely not a woman, because the woman, for modesty reasons, she's not going to be at the masjid, with the 50 men in front of her. And of course, even if she were teaching, it's going to be a barrier, and therefore, there's going to be that shyness to actually ask a question when there's another man that you can go to if you're a man. And the other part, which is in engaging in al-qada, engaging in courts. Engaging in courts was more towards men. Men were the ones that were holding those positions, and it wasn't women. And when we're looking at that, when are you bringing in those fatwas? When you're challenged. The women were not in those positions, therefore they weren't challenged with these cases, and that's why women were not the major fuqaha. They weren't the major scholars in fiqh, but they did an excellent job when it came to teaching Quran, tafsir, and hadith. They were able to transmit that ilm. So when we look at a lot of the scholars that were teaching, the women that were teaching, they weren't actually teaching as we would say it here, but this is somehow of, when she's knocking at the door, we just know that there is somebody that has ilm that was capable of indicating a mistake that happened from a student, but didn't necessarily engage as what we might call public engagement. Same thing when we look at Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani's family. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani did mention a number of scholars within his family. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani did mention a number of scholars, including his daughter, including his wife, Uns, and in fact he had more than one wife. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani had more than one wife, and he was the one that was actually teaching them. And including, of course, Al-Hafidh al-Iraqi, he had a number of daughters who were all scholars, but again did not necessarily teach as what we consider that they were holding a position in the masjid and actually teaching. So the other part was women. So where did they learn from? How did they have access to those education areas or not? Most of the women, they actually learned from their mahram, such as Salama, the daughter of Abu Dawood al-Sajistani, and Ibn Qudama and his daughters Rab'a and Ruqayya. Al-Hafidh al-Iraqi taught his own daughters, Juwayriyah and Zainab. You could see that more, and by the way, looking at and going back to the book A'lam al-Nisa, you could see that the majority of those women were actually taught from their own maharim, whether it was her grandfather, it was her maternal uncle, paternal uncle. It was really from the direct relatives, and it wasn't necessarily by going to the masjid and getting access to those scholars and being present. Were they not allowed to attend? Well, it's not that they were not allowed to attend, but there's a lot of haraj within the society when a woman is within all these group of men, so she would somehow shy away and probably get busy with other things, whether it's children, household, nursing, all these different things. And the women, they know very well that that takes a lot of time, and it's not like they had the means that we have today of making things in our life easier. It was pretty much the very primitive way in engaging in the different things around us. So a woman was going to be busy in preparing a lot of the different means for making family. And that was taking away a lot of her time. Now, we're going to continue next week. There's a lot to say about women in fiqh, inshallah, and hopefully next week, if not even, so next week will be our last day, hopefully, on the evolution of Muslim thinking, and we're talking about Muslim women scholarship, and we'll talk about a number of different things, inshallah. And hopefully next week will be our last day on evolution of Muslim thinking, and we'll be finishing there. So we're at 182 different slides. Oh no, 182 different slides, and hopefully we'll get to 91. Yeah, we'll get there. All right, Assalamu alaikum everyone, and jazakumullah or jazakumullah khairan. I could see that there are men and women here. All right, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Wa iyyakum. I'd be happy to answer any questions if there's anybody that has any questions regarding whether the topic of Shiism or women in scholarship. All right, and I'd be happy to unmute anybody if anybody wants to add anything or comment on anything. I'd also be happy to unmute. So if you just raise your hand, not on camera, but actually put your hand up. And all right, so assalamu alaikum everyone. Looks like we've come to an end. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.